Family of another death row inmate wants the state to take another look at evidence they say proves their loved one never got a fair trial. Abner Cantu is scheduled to die a week from now. Back in the year 2000, authorities say Cantu killed his cousin James Mosqueda and his cousin's fiancée Amy Kitchen in Collin County. But his family says they have evidence the state presented false testimony and evidence that makes jurors from the original trial have questions to this day.
In the final weeks of the year 2000, life in a quiet North Texas suburb moved at its usual unremarkable pace. Tree-lined streets, carefully maintained homes, and familiar routines defined the area. Few could have imagined that one of those homes would soon become the center of a criminal case that would echo through Texas courtrooms for more than 2 decades. What began as an investigation into the deaths of 2 young people would evolve into one of the most debated capital punishment cases in modern state history. James Mosqueda was 27 years old and appeared, by most outward measures, to be thriving. He lived in Plano, Texas, drove a sleek black Corvette, and was engaged to 22-year-old Amy Kitchen. Friends and acquaintances described them as a young couple with plans for the future. They were preparing for marriage, sharing a home, and building a life that seemed stable and hopeful. To neighbors, there was nothing unusual about the house or the couple who lived there. Nothing suggested that before long, the address would be sealed off with police tape. On the night of November 3, 2000, something went terribly wrong. When authorities eventually entered the home, they found James and Amy dead. James had been shot while in bed. Amy was found on the floor nearby. There were no signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, and no evidence of a struggle that suggested a random break-in. The scene immediately raised questions. Investigators would later testify that the lack of chaos indicated familiarity between the victims and whoever had been inside the house that night. Very quickly, attention turned toward someone the victims knew well. Abner Cantu, James Mosqueda's cousin, became the central figure in the investigation. At the time, Cantu was in his late 20s and living in an apartment not far from the victim's home. Prosecutors would later describe him as someone dealing with mounting personal pressure, financial instability, strained relationships, and unresolved conflict with his cousin. They argued that resentment and desperation, rather than impulse, played a role in what happened. From the beginning, this case was shaped as much by personal relationships as by physical evidence. Family ties, romantic partnerships, and shared histories all became critical elements in the story the state would present to a jury. Abner Cantu had grown up in Texas in what many would describe as an ordinary working-class environment. There were no widely reported incidents from his childhood that pointed toward future violence. Teachers, neighbors, and acquaintances later said he was not known as a troublemaker. He blended in. He did not stand out. His early life, at least on the surface, offered no warning signs. As an adult, however, his circumstances were less stable. He struggled to maintain steady employment and often faced financial stress. While his cousin James appeared to be moving upward socially and economically, Ivan's life felt far less secure. That contrast, prosecutors would later argue, mattered. James Mosqueda, by contrast, was portrayed at trial as confident and connected. Some witnesses described him as ambitious and charismatic. Others hinted at a darker side to his success. The defense would later emphasize rumors of drug involvement and risky business dealings, suggesting that James may have crossed paths with dangerous individuals unrelated to Abner Cantu. Those allegations, though never formally charged, would become a central part of the defense strategy. At the heart of the case was Ivan's relationship with his fiancée, Amy Bocher. Friends described their relationship as intense and emotional. It moved quickly, with the two spending much of their time together. But testimony and court records also painted a picture of instability. Financial pressure, substance use, and frequent arguments reportedly strained the relationship. Prosecutors would later argue that Amy Bocher became both a witness to and a participant in the aftermath of the crime, though not in the crime itself. As 2000 drew to a close, tensions appeared to be building. Ivan's relationship with his cousin James had deteriorated. Disagreements over money, accusations of betrayal, and lingering resentment created a widening rift. According to prosecutors, James represented more than family to Ivan. He symbolized everything Ivan felt he lacked. Whether that perception was accurate or not would become a matter of intense debate in court. On the evening of November 3rd, Ivan left his apartment. According to later testimony, he told Amy Bocher that he needed to take care of something. When he returned hours later, she would later claim, his demeanor had changed. She told investigators that his clothing was stained and that he appeared shaken. What he allegedly said to her that night would become one of the most damaging pieces of testimony at trial. Inside the Mosqueda home, investigators reconstructed what they believed had happened. The shots were fired at close range. The positioning of the bodies suggested the victims had little or no time to react. Crime scene analysts testified that the layout and lack of disturbance pointed to an intentional act carried out by someone who knew exactly why they were there. The investigation moved quickly. Within days, police located James Mosqueda's Corvette parked near Abner Cantu's apartment complex. Surveillance footage from surrounding areas helped establish a timeline of the vehicle's movement. That discovery alone did not prove guilt, but it raised serious questions. A search of Ivan's apartment produced additional evidence that prosecutors argued tied him directly to the crime. Hidden inside one of his shoes were keys, one that fit the Mosqueda home, and another that belonged to Amy Kitchen's vehicle. In the kitchen trash can, investigators found clothing stained with blood. Laboratory analysis later matched the DNA on those items to the victims. Ballistics evidence also played a significant role. Shell casings recovered from the crime scene were later matched to a .380 caliber pistol. That weapon was recovered from the residence of a former girlfriend of Abner Cantu. Fingerprints on the magazine were identified as Ivan's, further strengthening the state's case. As news spread through the neighborhood, residents struggled to make sense of what had happened. Police activity continued through the night and into the early morning. Flashing lights illuminated the quiet street as investigators documented the scene. For many neighbors, it was the first time they had seen such violence intrude on their community. The case soon escalated from a homicide investigation to a capital murder prosecution. Central to that shift was the testimony of Amy Bocher. According to court records, she told detectives that Ivan confessed to the shootings. She claimed he described what he had done, and later drove her past the victim's home, pointing out where the bodies were located. Prosecutors argued that her account aligned closely with the physical evidence. Abner Cantu was arrested without incident. Witnesses later described him as calm during the process. He did not offer a confession and did not attempt to flee. He maintained his innocence from the outset. By October 2001, the case was ready for trial. The courtroom became the arena where two sharply different narratives collided. The prosecution framed the case as a deliberate and calculated act, motivated by financial gain and personal resentment. They walked jurors through the evidence step by step, emphasizing how each piece reinforced the next. Keys, clothing, fingerprints, DNA, vehicle location, and witness testimony were woven into a cohesive story. Amy Bocher took the stand and recounted her version of events. She described Ivan leaving that night, returning hours later, and making statements that suggested responsibility for the killings. She admitted to disposing of his clothing, a detail that prosecutors argued demonstrated her knowledge of what had happened. The defense countered aggressively. They questioned Amy's credibility, highlighting inconsistencies in her statements and pointing to her own struggles with substance use. They argued that her testimony was unreliable and possibly influenced by fear or self-interest. They also emphasized James Mosqueda's alleged involvement in illegal activity, suggesting that someone else could have committed the murders. Despite those arguments, the jury found the prosecution's case convincing. Forensic experts testified at length about DNA and ballistics, and jurors appeared to give significant weight to the scientific evidence. When the verdict was read, Abner Cantu was found guilty of capital murder. The sentencing phase followed. Jurors were tasked with deciding whether Ivan would receive life imprisonment or death. After deliberation, they chose the death penalty. Ivan was transferred to death row at the Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. Life there was defined by isolation. Inmates spent most of their time confined to small cells with limited human contact. Over the years, prison records described Ivan as compliant and quiet. He did not accumulate serious disciplinary infractions. From behind bars, Ivan continued to assert his innocence. He wrote letters, gave interviews, and worked with legal teams to pursue appeals. His attorneys challenged multiple aspects of the case, including jury instructions, forensic handling, and the credibility of key witnesses. Each appeal was denied. As years passed, the case faded from public attention, until it didn't. Independent investigators, journalists, and podcasters began re-examining the evidence. They raised questions that had not gained traction during the original trial. One issue involved a Rolex watch. At trial, Amy Bocher testified that Ivan had taken James Mosqueda's watch and discarded it. Years later, defense attorneys obtained records suggesting the watch had been recovered at the crime scene. That discrepancy raised concerns about the accuracy of her testimony. Another point involved an engagement ring. Testimony suggested Ivan had proposed with a ring taken from Amy Kitchen after the murders. Later, affidavits indicated the ring may have been seen before the killings, casting doubt on that claim. A retired police officer later submitted an affidavit stating that during a welfare check at Ivan's apartment shortly after the murders, the trash can appeared empty. That statement conflicted with trial testimony regarding when the bloody clothing was placed there. Perhaps most significant was a statement from Amy Bocher's brother, who later admitted that his trial testimony may have been unreliable due to heavy drug use at the time. His recorded admission reignited debate about whether the jury had heard the full truth. These developments prompted renewed legal efforts. Several jurors from the original trial signed affidavits stating they no longer felt confident in the verdict. In April 2023, a judge temporarily halted the execution to allow further review. Hope flickered briefly for Ivan and his supporters. But in August 2023, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals ruled that the new evidence did not meet the legal standard required for relief. The execution was rescheduled. On February 28, 2024, after more than 23 years on death row, Abner Cantu was transferred to Huntsville for execution. He spent his final hours quietly, meeting with a chaplain and declining any special requests. That evening, witnesses gathered behind glass. When given the opportunity to speak, Ivan again asserted his innocence and thanked those who had supported him. Shortly after the lethal injection was administered, he was pronounced dead. Reactions to the execution were deeply divided. For the families of James Mosqueda and Amy Kitchen, it marked the end of a long and painful chapter. For others, it raised unresolved questions about justice, evidence, and the irreversible nature of capital punishment. This case continues to be discussed not only for what happened in a Plano home in 2000, but for what it reveals about the criminal justice system itself. It stands as a reminder that once a sentence is carried out, debate may continue, but answers do not always come with closure. If stories like this make you think deeply about truth, justice, and the power of the legal system, make sure to subscribe. The next case we examine will challenge you just as much.